Every day at exactly 12:30 p.m., Officer Jake Bennett would leave the station with his traditional sandwich wrapped in brown paper and head to the small city park. Along the way, he always encountered Emily, a homeless woman who, despite her hardships, maintained a kind smile and a look of gratitude. She sat on the farthest bench in the park, always under the shade of a large tree. Jake, a man with a generous heart, had decided months ago to share his meals with her. He could easily afford 2 sandwiches, and over time, the act of sharing his lunch with Emily had become an unbreakable routine. He had never directly asked her about her past, but in brief conversations, she would occasionally let slip fragments of a life that once seemed very different. A promising career, a home, a family. Now, all of that seemed distant. Jake, on the other hand, led a simple but stable life. Having worked as a police officer for over 10 years, he was known for his professionalism and empathy, especially towards society's marginalized. He saw something in Emily that others didn't: dignity. To him, she wasn't just another homeless person, but someone with a story that deserved respect. One day, when Jake arrived at the park, the bench was empty. Emily wasn't there, which was unusual. He looked around, expecting her to show up at any moment, but nothing. The space felt desolate without her. A sense of unease began to grow inside him. What could have happened? She had never failed to show up in the past few months. As he waited, Jake began to recall the small signs she had been giving. The occasional coughs, her growing paleness, and how in recent days she seemed more tired than usual. The thought that she might be ill hit him like a shock. He abruptly stood up and began asking nearby homeless people if they had seen Emily, but no one had any concrete information. Back at the station that afternoon, the image of Emily wouldn't leave Jake's mind. He knew life on the streets was unforgiving, and something inside him told him he couldn't ignore her disappearance. Jake decided to patrol the areas of the city where she used to appear. After a frustrating, unsuccessful search, he found himself reflecting on how, to most people, Emily was invisible. Just another statistic in the city, another faceless person on its cold streets. But to Jake, she was a friend. The next day, when he returned to the park, he felt relieved to see her on the usual bench. Emily was there, but clearly weakened. Her face was pale and her eyes, always bright, seemed dim. "Emily, where were you yesterday?" Jake asked, trying to mask the concern in his voice. She gave him a weak smile and shrugged. "Sometimes you just have to disappear for a while, right?" she replied in a hoarse voice, causing Jake to frown. He knew something was wrong, but Emily didn't seem willing to talk about it. Instead, they shared their lunch in silence, an odd calm between them. Jake decided that he needed to help her in a more concrete way, but wasn't sure how to do so without invading her personal space. That night, as he reflected on what to do, an idea began to form in his mind. He decided to take action. He couldn't ignore the situation any longer. Something needed to change, and he would be by her side to ensure this was the start of a transformation. Jake couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Over the past few months, he had developed a special affection for her. It wasn't just compassion for her being homeless, but something deeper, a human connection that transcended their life circumstances. She was intelligent, articulate, and sometimes seemed out of place on the streets. The park where they met was in the heart of the city, a curious contrast between towering skyscrapers and people living in misery. The city itself was always moving, but for those on the margins, like Emily, time seemed to pass differently. Jake watched the passers-by, many of whom walked by Emily without even noticing her. There was a glaring indifference in those streets. It was as if the city had grown accustomed to the presence of the homeless, to the point where they had become part of the scenery. Jake had asked several times about Emily's family, but she always avoided the subject. In one of their conversations, she had casually mentioned a son she hadn't seen in years. "He must be in his 20s now," she had said once without giving many details. Jake tried to respect her silence, but that information echoed in his mind. Was someone out there looking for her? Was there a son somewhere waiting to reunite with his mother? One afternoon, while walking together through the park after lunch, Jake decided to break the cycle of light conversations and asked directly, "Emily, do you have anywhere to go? Anyone you can count on?" She stopped walking and was silent for a few moments. The cold wind blew through the trees, making her worn-out clothes flutter. She looked down at the ground before answering. "A long time ago, I had a different life, Jake. But things, they fell apart. There's no one left for me." Jake felt a pang in his chest. He wanted to know more, to understand what had led her to this situation, but he realized she wasn't ready to tell. Instead, he took a deep breath and decided he would help her, even if she resisted. That night, Jake used his resources as a police officer to discreetly investigate Emily's past. He knew it might seem like an invasion of privacy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. His searches revealed Emily's full name, Emily Hargrave. With this information, he found some clues. Years ago, Emily had been a respected journalist for a major city newspaper. However, everything changed when she lost her husband in a tragic car accident, an event that seemed to trigger a downward spiral. The old news articles didn't mention her son, but Emily's career downfall and her subsequent life on the streets were evident. The next day, Jake gently but firmly confronted Emily. "Emily, I looked into your past," he said as they shared lunch once again in the park. She looked at him with a mix of surprise and hurt. "Why?" Her voice sounded betrayed, as if he had crossed a line she didn't want touched. "Because I want to help you, but I need to know more about you to do that the right way," Jake replied honestly, trying to stay calm. "I know you had a different life, a good life. I'm not here to judge you, but I want to understand what I can do to help you get out of this." Emily lowered her head, and for the first time, Jake saw tears beginning to roll down her face. "There's nothing you can do, Jake. I've lost myself, and everything. My career, my son, my dignity. I'm not that woman you read about in the files anymore. That person died when my husband did." Jake's heart ached at her words. Now he understood that there was a deep pain behind this strong woman, a pain that kept her trapped in the past. "But you're still alive, Emily. There's still time to rebuild something if you want to," he said, his voice firm but full of tenderness. "And I'm here to help you do that." She didn't respond, but Jake knew the seeds of change had been planted. It wouldn't be easy, but he felt this was the beginning of a new phase in Emily's life, even if she didn't realize it yet. The days passed, and Jake continued to meet Emily in the park every day. However, something had changed between them. The conversation about Emily's past seemed to have opened a wound she preferred to keep closed. Although she still accepted the food Jake brought her, her demeanor was more closed off, and she spoke less. Jake's words about rebuilding her life lingered in her mind, but the fear and shame of facing what she had lost kept her silent. Jake, in turn, was beginning to feel the pressure of time. He knew Emily wasn't well, that her physical health was increasingly compromised by life on the streets. Winter was approaching, and the nights were getting colder by the day. The idea that she might not survive the harsher months made Jake anxious. He knew he needed to act fast, but he also understood that forcing Emily to accept help might drive her away for good. One morning, when Jake arrived at the station, he was met with a surprise. A well-dressed middle-aged woman was waiting for him at the reception. There was something familiar about her face, but Jake couldn't immediately place it. As he approached, the woman introduced herself. "My name is Sarah Hargrave," she said with a determined look. "I'm Emily's sister." Jake was speechless for a few moments. He had never known that Emily had a sister, and Sarah's sudden appearance raised many questions in his mind. "How did you know?" he began, but Sarah interrupted him as if she knew exactly what he was going to ask. "I've been trying to find Emily for years," she explained, her voice shaky. "I saw one of your fellow officers talking to her in the park. I waited for a chance to talk to you." Jake invited her to sit, listening intently as Sarah recounted the years of searching. After the accident that took Emily's husband's life, she had fallen into a deep depression. Though the family tried to help, she distanced herself from everyone. Eventually, she disappeared without a trace. Sarah had never given up searching for her sister, but over the years, she had lost hope of finding her alive. She's not the same person," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "And I know I was wrong for not trying harder to stay with her. But please, help me. I want to bring her home. I want her to know that she still has a family, that we still love her." Jake saw in those words a chance to do something big for Emily. He knew that Sarah's presence could be the push Emily needed to start rebuilding herself. But at the same time, he also knew Emily well enough to realize that forcing this reunion could be devastating. "I'll talk to her," Jake replied finally. "But I can't promise anything. She's very proud, and she's terrified of facing the past." That afternoon at the park, Jake found Emily sitting on the bench as usual. However, her exhaustion was more evident. He hesitated but knew he couldn't put off the conversation any longer. "Emily, I need to talk to you about something important," he began, sitting next to her. She looked at him curiously, but her expression was dark, as if she already sensed something was coming. "Your sister, Sarah, she found you. She's in town. She wants to see you, to help you." Emily's face stiffened. She shook her head, as if denying to herself that this was true. "No, I can't face this," she whispered, more to herself than to Jake. "Emily, she wants to help you. She never gave up looking for you. I think this is your chance to change things, he insisted, his tone gentle but firm. Emily stood up abruptly and began pacing, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. I'm not the person she knew anymore. I can't go back to that life. What will she think of me? What will my son think of me? I failed them. Jake remained silent for a few moments, giving her space to process her emotions. When he saw that she was starting to calm down, he approached her slowly and said, "We all fail in some way, Emily. But that doesn't mean you can't try again. Your sister is still here for you. Doesn't that mean something to you?" Emily took a deep breath, tears now flowing freely. After a few minutes, she turned to Jake and said, almost in a whisper, "I'm afraid it's too late. It's never too late to try," Jake replied softly. Emily stayed silent for a long time, staring into the distance. Something inside her was beginning to change. Perhaps for the first time in years, she was ready to face the past. "Take me to her," she said at last. Jake drove quietly through the city streets, with Emily sitting beside him in the car. The tension in the air was palpable, and he could feel her nervousness. Emily had barely spoken a word since agreeing to meet her sister. It was as if the weight of her past was crushing her in that moment. With every street they passed, they grew closer to Sarah, but Emily seemed further away from the life she had been living for the past few years. Jake tried to think of something to say to calm her, but he knew that any words might feel empty. He had done what he could to encourage her. Now it was up to her. As they drove, Emily, without warning, began to speak. Her voice was low but heavy with emotion. "I never imagined it would end up like this. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I was a good mother, Jake. I had a career, a family. But after Adam died, everything fell apart. I just lost my way." She looked out the window as if trying to escape her own memory. Jake just listened, giving her the space she needed. "I couldn't get back up. I sank into debt, lost my job, lost my house. My son went to live with my sister because I couldn't take care of him. That destroyed me. I left him, Jake. I abandoned him." Her voice wavered with the pain she carried. Jake kept his eyes on the road, fighting the urge to interrupt her. He knew this was the first time Emily was confronting her deepest feelings in years. "I wonder every day, would he forgive me? Would he even recognize me now?" Emily wiped a tear from her face, her body seeming more fragile than ever. "You never abandoned him, Emily. You were going through something that would have broken anyone," Jake said softly. "And from what I've seen, your sister never gave up on you. I'm sure your son hasn't either." Emily didn't respond, but part of her wanted to believe Jake's words. The fear and shame consumed her, but the idea of reuniting with her son and sister, despite all the mistakes and failures of the past, was beginning to take root inside her. Finally, they arrived at the designated spot, a small cafe in a quiet neighborhood. Jake parked the car, and Emily remained still for a few seconds, taking deep breaths as if preparing for the hardest battle of her life. Jake stepped out and opened the door for her. She got out slowly, her body tense, and her gaze fixed on the entrance to the cafe. "I'll be with you," Jake said, offering an encouraging smile. Emily nodded slightly, but her eyes were filled with fear. As they entered, they saw Sarah sitting at a table in the corner, nervously fidgeting with her coffee cup. When she saw Emily, Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she remained still, as if afraid that any movement might shatter the moment. Emily stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to do. "Sarah," Emily murmured, her voice breaking. Sarah stood up slowly and approached her without hesitation. The two stood face to face for a few seconds, saying nothing. Then Sarah made the first move, embracing Emily tightly, as if she never wanted to let her go. Emily, initially hesitant, finally gave in, returning the embrace and letting the tears fall freely. "I missed you so much," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never stopped looking for you." Emily cried silently, both relieved and terrified by the reunion. She knew that, while this was a first step, there was still much to be mended. But the warmth of Sarah's embrace made her feel, for the first time in years, that she was home. As Jake watched the scene unfold, he felt a wave of relief. He knew this moment was crucial, but he also understood that the reunion wouldn't solve everything immediately. Sarah had fought to find her sister, and now she would have to fight to keep her close. Emily, on the other hand, would have to confront the ghosts of her past and try to rebuild her relationship with the family she had once left behind. After a few minutes, Sarah pulled back slightly, holding Emily's hands and looking into her eyes. "You can come home if you want. We'll help you. You don't have to face this alone," Sarah said, with a firmness that seemed to convey an unbreakable promise. Emily didn't know what to say. She was emotional, but still afraid. However, Her sister's love and strength were beginning to break through the walls she had built around herself. She wasn't ready to fully accept it yet, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility. Jake discreetly stepped away, realizing that this moment now belonged to them. He knew his role there was nearly complete, but the real work was just beginning for Emily and Sarah. The reunion was only the beginning of a long journey toward healing. In the days that followed the cafe reunion, Sarah and Emily slowly began to reconnect. Sarah managed to convince Emily to spend a few nights at her apartment, a simple but cozy place with a spare room for her. Emily hesitated to accept the offer, still feeling uncomfortable and out of place, but Sarah insisted, arguing that at least there, in the warmth of a home, she would be safe from the impending winter. Jake watched closely, pleased with the progress he saw, but he knew that Emily still carried a shadow that prevented her from fully embracing the idea of getting back on her feet. That first night at Sarah's apartment, Emily barely slept. Lying in the neatly made bed, between clean sheets, she felt a mix of relief and restlessness. Every little comfort reminded her of the life she had lost, but also of how much she still had to face. She knew this was only the beginning. Sleeping there didn't mean she was ready to forgive herself or to seek forgiveness from her son. The next morning, Sarah encouraged her to take a shower and put on some new clothes she had bought for her. Emily was reluctant, but eventually agreed. Looking at herself in the bathroom mirror after so long, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back seemed different, still marked by years on the streets, but there was something new there. A thread of hope? She wasn't sure. The hot water and the feeling of cleanliness brought a sense of renewal, but the weight of the past still pressed down on her shoulders. Jake, as usual, paid a visit that day. Sarah invited him for coffee, and the three of them chatted briefly in the small living room. Emily was quieter than usual, clearly struggling with something inside. Then Sarah brought up the issue that everyone knew, at some point, would have to be addressed. Emily's son. "I talked to David," Sarah said, hesitant, but knowing this step had to be taken. "He wants to see you, Emily." The name David made Emily freeze. It was as if all the walls she had tried to keep up crumbled at once. Her son, the boy she had left behind. He was now a man with his own life, and the thought of facing him brought back all her fears and guilt. She looked at Sarah, eyes wide with fear. "No, I can't." Emily shook her head vehemently. How will he look at me? What will he think of me? I failed him, Sarah. I'm not the mother he deserves. Emily, he wants to see you," Sarah replied gently but firmly. "He wants to hear your story, to understand why you left. He deserves that, and you deserve a chance to explain." Jake remained silent, sensing that this was the turning point. Everything that had happened so far, the reunion with Sarah, the offer of a home, the safe nights, led up to this moment. Reuniting with David wasn't just about Emily becoming part of the family again. It was about her finally confronting her past and starting to forgive herself. Emily stood up abruptly from the table, her breath quickening. She paced back and forth in the living room, as if trying to escape from herself. "No," she said, louder now. "He hates me. He must hate me. I abandoned him. He doesn't hate you," Sarah insisted. "He just wants to understand what happened. And I think you need that too." Emily stopped and covered her face with her hands. Silent tears began to run down her face. Deep down, she knew Sarah was right, but the fear of rejection paralyzed her. For years, she had survived by imagining that the world had forgotten about her, that no one missed her. Facing David meant facing the consequences of her choices, and the idea terrified her. Jake finally spoke up. "Emily, I know this feels impossible right now. I know you think he won't forgive you, but running from this will only keep hurting you. You have a chance to change things. Don't let fear stop you from moving forward." Emily looked at Jake with tear-swollen eyes, as if searching for the strength she couldn't find in herself. And then something shifted. Maybe it was Jake's words, or the unconditional love from Sarah, or simply the fact that she couldn't keep living in the past. Slowly, Emily nodded. I don't know if I'm ready, but if he wants to see me, then I'll go." The words came out with difficulty, but they were there. What had once been a shadow of doubt was now becoming a concrete decision. Emily knew this would be the hardest step of her life, but she also knew that if she didn't take it, she would remain trapped in the same cycle of pain and regret. Sarah, relieved, smiled warmly and hugged her, while Jake kept a respectful distance, knowing this was their moment. But he knew this was the real turning point. No matter what happened from here, Emily was finally allowing herself to believe she was worthy of redemption. The day of the meeting between Emily and David finally arrived. The tension in Sarah's apartment was palpable. Emily could barely breathe from the anxiety. She knew that moment could change everything. The fear of seeing the rejection she so dreaded in David's eyes was eating her up inside. The weeks leading up to the meeting had been an emotional roller coaster. Some nights Emily cried herself to sleep, imagining what it would be like to face her son. On others, she allowed herself to dream of a peaceful reunion, where maybe she could regain part of the life she had lost. Jake arrived at the apartment that morning to offer support. He didn't want to interfere, but he knew his presence brought some comfort to Emily. She had confided in him in recent days that she didn't know if she'd have the courage to face her son without someone by her side. Even with Sarah there, Jake had become an emotional anchor. He knew her pain, had seen the worst of her, and still believed in her ability to start over. On the way to the meeting spot, a small park away from the hustle and bustle of the city, Emily barely said a word. Sarah drove in silence, respecting the space her sister needed. Jake, sitting beside Emily in the back seat, could feel her hands trembling. He gently held her hand, offering a small but significant gesture of support. "You can do this," he said in a calm voice, looking at her. Emily just nodded, still unable to speak. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if trying to prepare her heart for what was to come. When they arrived at the park, they saw David already sitting on one of the benches. He looked tense, glancing around as if trying to process the impending meeting. He was a young adult in his early 20s with a serious expression on his face. Time had changed the boy Emily remembered, but at the same time she could still see familiar traits. He had his father's eyes, the same way of furrowing his brow when he was focused. Emily suddenly stopped, her body paralyzed by fear. Everything she had imagined, all the words she had rehearsed in her mind, suddenly vanished. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought she might faint at any moment. "I can't," she murmured, taking a step back. Jake quickly stepped in front of her, blocking her retreat. "Emily, look at me," he said, holding her shoulders firmly, but gently. "You've come this far. Don't give up now. You have a chance to reconnect with him, to show him you never stopped loving him, despite everything that happened. This is more than most people get. Don't let fear stop you." Jake's words seemed to break through the walls of fear that had formed around Emily. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and looked over at Sarah, who smiled encouragingly. "We're here with you," said Sarah, placing a hand on her sister's shoulder. Emily finally took a step forward. Each step felt like a challenge, but with each one, she felt a small spark of strength growing inside her. Jake and Sarah stayed a little behind, giving space for the meeting to be between mother and son. David looked up as she approached, his eyes meeting Emily's. For a moment, the world stopped. Time seemed frozen as mother and son stared at each other, both unsure of what to say. "David," Emily said, her voice shaky but soft. I don't know where to start. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything." She expected the worst. She expected him to explode in anger or simply stand up and walk away. But to her surprise, he remained seated, his expression a mix of sadness and confusion. "I'm not here to judge you," he finally said, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "I'm here because I want to understand. Why did you leave, Mom? Why didn't you ever come back?" Emily's heart seemed to shatter at hearing the word Mom from David's lips. It was the first time in years someone had called her that, and it caused all the emotion she had bottled up inside to overflow. "I was wrong," she admitted, tears starting to fall again. "I was wrong with you. After your father died, I lost myself. I didn't know how to move forward. I thought you'd be better off without me, that I couldn't take care of you anymore. But not a day went by that I didn't think about you. Never." David watched her closely, absorbing her words. He didn't say anything immediately, but his silence wasn't one of rejection. It was a silence filled with deep emotion as he processed what he was hearing. "You were wrong," he said at last, his voice firm but not angry. "I needed you, and I never stopped waiting for you to come back." Emily was sobbing now, unable to hold back the pain and guilt she felt. But at the same time, she felt a strange sense of relief. He was still there, still willing to listen to her. There was still a chance to make things right. The days after the reunion with David were intense for Emily. The conversations at the park marked the beginning of a long healing process for both her and her son. Although the meeting had been charged with emotion, it wasn't an immediate miracle. There was still a long road ahead, filled with hurt and unanswered questions. That night, Emily returned to Sarah's apartment feeling exhausted, but in a different way. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She couldn't predict what her future with David would look like, but just having had the chance to apologize and hear his words was already a monumental step. The next day, David called her. It was a brief call, but one filled with meaning. He hadn't rejected her. On the contrary, he wanted to continue the conversation. They decided to meet again, this time for a quiet walk in the park. Without the initial tension, the second meeting flowed more naturally. David shared what his life had been like with Sarah, how he had also struggled with grief and abandonment. He talked about school, college, and the tough moments when he had wished his mother was around. Though his words were painful for Emily to hear, there was something profoundly healing in them. She could see that, despite everything, he still wanted her in his life. As they walked, Emily finally began to feel something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. She was still broken, but there were cracks where the light was beginning to come through. Jake and Sarah were the pillars supporting her on this journey, and David, at his own pace, was reconnecting. Despite this, Emily knew the road wouldn't be easy. The wounds of the past don't heal overnight. She still had her ups and downs, dealing with the regret and guilt that resurfaced in moments of solitude. Some nights, she would wake up from nightmares, reliving the moment she decided to walk away from David. The pain of that abandonment. Jake, always by her side, helped her find ways to cope with these emotions. He encouraged her to be kind to herself, to understand that the mistakes she made didn't define who she was now. One afternoon, Jake and Emily met at the park, the same place where it had all begun. The weather was warmer, a sign that spring was approaching, and the park was full of life. Emily seemed different that afternoon, lighter, more serene. There was a brightness in her eyes that Jake hadn't seen since he'd known her. "You look good," Jake commented with a light smile. Emily sat down on the bench next to him and sighed. "I think I'm starting to believe that it's possible to move on," she said, gazing at the horizon. "It's not easy, but after talking to David, I realized that maybe I do deserve a second chance." Jake nodded, proud of the progress she was making. He knew it hadn't been easy for Emily to reach this point. Still, there was a road ahead, full of challenges, but he was confident that she was more prepared than ever to face them. "And how's your relationship with Sarah?" Jake asked, slightly shifting the tone of the conversation. "Better than I expected," Emily replied, smiling. "She's been my rock this whole time. I wouldn't have been able to take the first step without her." Emily paused and looked directly at Jake, her eyes full of gratitude. "And without you too. I wouldn't be here now if you hadn't insisted. If you hadn't believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. I have no words to thank you, Jake." Jake looked at her and smiled, a simple smile, but one full of meaning. "You did all this on your own, Emily. I was just around to remind you how strong you are." The silence between them was peaceful, as if they didn't need any more words to understand each other. There, in that park where they had shared so many lunches, Emily realized that she was finally starting to find her place in the world again. In the following days, Emily decided to seek professional help. With Sarah and Jake's encouragement, she accepted that she needed to face her traumas more deeply, without running from her emotions anymore. She found a therapist who specialized in grief and emotional trauma, and therapy sessions became part of her routine. With each session, Emily unraveled a little more of the tangled pain she carried. She relived difficult memories, confronted her deepest fears, and slowly began to find tools to... Jake and Sarah became a constant support system, while David, more cautiously, also began to open up to the possibility of reconnection. A significant moment occurred when David invited her to visit his college. It was a small step, but for Emily, it was monumental. Walking through the halls where her son studied, meeting his friends and professors, made her feel proud of him, but also of herself for being there, present in his life again. Their relationship was still under construction, but the distance that had once seemed insurmountable was now slowly closing. Emily began to realize that, with time, patience, and love, she could not only rebuild her relationship with David, but also rebuild herself. As the weeks passed, Emily's life continued to transform. Therapy helped her organize her thoughts and understand the traumas that had led her to life on the streets. Her conversations with David became more frequent and less tense. Each meeting seemed to chip away at another piece of the wall that had been erected between mother and son. David, though cautious, was willing to get to know the woman his mother was becoming. He saw that she was no longer the same person who had left him years ago. Emily still blamed herself for many of her past mistakes, but now there was more acceptance, more clarity about what had led her to fail, and, above all, more hope. He still didn't easily call her mom, but she knew that was part of the healing process for both of them. Sarah, on the other hand, played a key role in this transition period. Always by her sister's side, she organized small family gatherings, slowly reintegrating Emily into the family circle. At one of these gatherings, Sarah suggested something that would force Emily to face one of her biggest challenges since the start of her journey: a family dinner, where not only David would be present, but also other relatives. including some who had judged her harshly in the past. When Sarah first mentioned the idea, Emily felt panic return. The mere thought of being in a room full of relatives, many of whom she hadn't seen in years, was terrifying. She knew that to them, she still carried the stigma of having abandoned her son. And although she was on a path to recovery, the fear of facing their judgments still paralyzed her. "Sarah, I don't know if I'm ready for this," Emily said, worried one afternoon while they were sitting in the living room of the apartment. "I understand, Emily, but this isn't just about them. It's about you too. You've been through so much, and you deserve to show how much you've changed. They need to understand who you've become as well," Sarah said, in an encouraging tone. "And besides, you won't be alone. David and I will be there with you." Emily thought for a long moment. Part of her wanted to retreat, to hide again. But another part, the part that was growing, knew this was the opportunity to confront the past head-on. It was another step to prove, mostly to herself, that she was willing to fight for her redemption. "All right," she replied with a heavy sigh. "I'll go, but I don't know how I'll feel." "You'll do great," Sarah assured her with a smile. "And if you need to, you can leave at any time. You just need to take the first step." In the days leading up to the dinner, Jake stayed by Emily's side, offering the emotional support she so desperately needed. He knew this would be a trial by fire for her, and he could see how much it stirred up her insecurities. Even so, he also recognized how much Emily had changed since the day he first met her in the park, sitting alone on the bench, barely eating. Now, she was a woman who, though marked by scars, was beginning to rise again and face her fears with courage. On the night of the dinner, Emily was nervous. Jake stopped by her apartment to take her to Sarah's house, where the dinner would be held. When he saw her, he noticed that for the first time, Emily had dressed in a way that showed a certain confidence. She wore a simple but well-kept outfit, and her hair was clean and loose. However, her eyes still reflected uncertainty. "You look great," Jake said, offering a comforting smile. "And most importantly, you're doing this for yourself, not for them." Emily smiled back, a shy but genuine smile. Jake's words always calmed her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Along the way, she focused on staying calm, recalling her therapy sessions, her talks with David, and Sarah's supportive moments. When they arrived at Sarah's house, Emily hesitated for a moment as she saw the cars parked outside. She knew that some of the people inside had been critical and ruthless with her in the past, and the fear of reliving those moments washed over her. But then, she took a deep breath, looked at Jake, who was patiently waiting, and decided to move forward. "I'm ready," she said, more to herself than to Jake. As they entered the house, Emily was immediately met by an atmosphere that made her feel the weight of the past. The familiar smell of homemade food, the voices echoing through the halls, everything seemed to bring back memories of a lost time. However, this time, something was different. She was there by choice, determined not to run anymore. David was in the living room, chatting with some relatives. But as soon as he saw Emily, he approached her immediately. "I'm glad you came," he said with a reserved smile. Emily looked at him, and in that moment, she knew that the real test was just beginning. Inside Sarah's house, the sound of conversations and laughter filled the space. But for Emily, the noise felt distant and muffled, as if she was separated from those people by an invisible barrier. The nervousness she had managed to control on the way over now surged back with full force. However, when she looked at David and Sarah, who welcomed her with genuine smiles, she knew she wasn't alone. Still, there was an undeniable sense of looming judgment in the air. The first moments were uncomfortable. Emily's relatives were clearly surprised by her presence. Some observed her with curious glances, while others kept a polite distance, avoiding direct eye contact. They knew her story, knew what had happened, yet no one dared to bring it up directly. Emily sat at the table with slightly trembling hands, trying to appear calmer than she really was. Jake and Sarah were by her side, and David sat directly across from her, which gave her some comfort. As dinner progressed, the conversations flowed around her, but she remained silent, just observing and trying to absorb the situation. "Emily, you look really well," a distant cousin finally commented, breaking the ice. "It's been so long since we've seen you." Her voice was soft, but there was a note of curiosity, as if she was trying to understand what had changed in the woman in front of her. Emily forced a smile and thanked her, trying to keep the dialogue light, but it was inevitable. At some point, someone would mention the past, and it happened. One of her older uncles, a man known for his strong opinions and bluntness, set his wine glass down with a slight thud and looked directly at Emily. He wasn't one for small talk, and the tension in his voice made it clear that he didn't share the other's patience. "So, Emily," he began, drawing everyone's attention at the table, "you finally came back. We were starting to think you had forgotten you still had a family." The air seemed to grow heavier suddenly. Sarah immediately glanced at Emily, ready to step in if needed. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing that this was the moment everyone had been dreading. David, for his part, watched silently, his eyes fixed on his mother, as if waiting for her reaction. Emily felt the impact of her uncle's words like a sharp knife. She knew this could happen, but even so, hearing the direct accusation was painful. The words brought back all the guilt and shame she had been carrying. The silence spread across the table, and now all eyes were on her, waiting for her response. She could have stood up and left. She could have run, like she had so many times before, but something inside her had changed. She knew she couldn't hide anymore. This was the moment that would define her new path, the moment she had to face the truth about her mistakes, and at the same time, show that she was willing to change. Emily took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside her. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm but full of emotion. "I deserve that," she said, her tone sincere. "I deserve to be judged because I failed. I failed my family. I abandoned the people who mattered most to me, and there's nothing I can say that will change what happened." The silence continued. Emily's words hung in the air, each one carrying a real and undeniable weight. But as she spoke, she felt something shift inside her. It was as if, by openly acknowledging her mistakes, she was finally freeing herself from the emotional prison that had held her captive for so long. "But," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "I'm not here to ask for unconditional acceptance. I'm not here to try to erase what I did. I just want the chance to show that I'm a different person now. I'm really trying to rebuild my life, and I know this is the first step of many." She looked around the table, her eyes meeting each familiar face until they finally rested on David's. He was watching her closely, and in that moment, she realized that the most important judgment wasn't from the others. It was from him. He was the one to whom she owed the greatest debt. David held his gaze steady for a few seconds, and then something unexpected happened. He leaned forward and, with an almost imperceptible smile, said, "I believe you." Those words broke the silence at the table in a way no one anticipated. Emily felt an immense sense of relief wash over her. Tears began to form in her eyes, but this time, they weren't from pain or regret. They were from hope. If David, the person she feared losing the most, was willing to give her a chance, maybe there really was a way to redeem herself. Jake and Sarah smiled, relieved, and soon the tension around the table began to dissipate. Conversations resumed, lighter this time. Emily knew not everyone there would be ready to forgive her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could move forward without the weight of her past completely crushing her. She hadn't won every battle, but that moment was an important victory. The dinner continued, and she spoke with a few relatives more openly, exchanging stories and listening attentively. She felt that little by little she was being seen as someone fighting for a second chance, and that, in itself, was a start. At that moment, with David by her side, Emily knew the road ahead would still be long, but now she was willing to walk it, unafraid of what lay ahead. The family dinner, which had begun with tension and uncertainty, ended on a lighter and more welcoming note. Emily knew there was still a long way to go, but that night had proven that a fresh start was possible. It didn't matter if complete forgiveness would take time, or if some family members still harbored resentment. The most important thing was that she had begun to forgive herself, and that was the foundation for true change. In the days that followed, Emily kept in touch with David and Sarah. The reconciliation between mother and son was still ongoing, and each conversation seemed to bring a little more healing. The wounds were still there, healing slowly, but for the first time in years, Emily felt she could be part of David's life in a positive way. Jake also remained by her side, offering the quiet support he always had. He never pressured her, but he was there when she needed him, ready to remind Emily how much she had achieved. His role in her life was discreet but essential. Jake saw in Emily not just a person he had helped, but a woman who had found strength where no one else believed it existed. Their bond grew in a profound way, marked by mutual trust. One day, Emily was sitting in the same park where her journey of transformation had begun. The sun shone through the trees, and the sound of children's laughter echoed around her, bringing a sense of peace. She remembered how, just a few months earlier, she had sat on that bench, disheveled and desolate, unable to see a way out of her life. Now, everything felt different. She still carried the scars of her past, but now she saw them as a reminder of how much she had overcome. David appeared in the distance, walking toward her. He now came to the park regularly to meet her, as a way of maintaining the bond they were rebuilding. As he approached, Emily smiled and stood up to greet him. "Hi, Mom," said David without hesitation, making Emily's heart beat faster. That word, which once seemed so distant, was now spoken naturally, and it was one of the greatest signs that they were finally healing the wounds of the past. "Hi, son," Emily replied with a genuine smile as they sat down on the bench together. They talked about simple things: David's work at college, Emily's progress in therapy, and the small steps she continued to take in her recovery. There was no longer the constant weight of guilt or regret. There was only a mother and son, learning to rediscover each other. Emily knew the future would still bring challenges, but now she had something she had never believed possible before: a second chance. And this time, she wouldn't waste it. Emily's story reminds us that, even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of starting over. We all face challenges and regrets, but it is through the courage to face our mistakes that we find the strength to move forward. If this story touched you, think of someone who might need a second chance. Sometimes, a small gesture of support can be the first step in transforming a life. Share this message with those who, like Emily, may find hope and redemption where they least expect it. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to keep up with our moving and inspiring stories. And don't go just yet. Click on the next video appearing here on the screen and keep being moved by more stories. See you in the next video.